My daughter-in-law and my grandson pranked me by abandoning me on a deserted road during a storm, 200 miles away. "Run, old lady. Learn to survive," he said. I never went back. 8 months later, they tracked me down. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the rain. I sat in the passenger seat of Lance's pickup truck, clutching my purse tighter as lightning split the sky ahead of us. At 66, I should have known better than to trust my 28-year-old grandson when he offered to drive me to my doctor's appointment in the city. "Thanks for taking me, honey," I said, raising my voice over the thunder. "I know it's a long drive." Lance didn't respond. His jaw was set in that hard line I'd seen too often lately, especially when Ophelia was around. My daughter-in-law had that effect on him, turning my sweet grandson into someone I barely recognized. "The GPS says we're still 2 hours from Dr. Henderson's office," I continued, trying to make conversation. "Maybe we should pull over until this storm passes." That's when Lance started slowing down. At first I thought he was being sensible, finding a safe place to wait out the weather. But when he pulled onto a gravel road that led to absolutely nowhere, my stomach dropped. "Lance, where are we going?" He stopped the truck in the middle of what looked like an abandoned parking lot. Through the rain-streaked windows, I could see nothing but empty fields stretching in every direction. No buildings, no other cars, no signs of life. "Get out," he said, his voice flat and cold. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "What did you say?" I said, "Get out, Grandma." He turned to look at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood freeze. Pure contempt. "Ophelia and I are done with you. Done with your constant doctor visits, your pills, your complaints. You're a burden we can't carry anymore." The words hit me like physical blows. "Lance, I don't understand. What are you talking about? You really don't get it, do you?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You've been sucking the life out of our family for years. Do you know how much money we've spent on your medical bills? How many weekends we've wasted driving you places because you're too scared to drive yourself?" I felt my hands start to shake. I never asked for anything I didn't need. The doctor said my heart condition requires regular monitoring." "Your heart condition," he repeated mockingly. "You mean the one where you pop pills every time you feel a little anxious? Face it, Grandma. You're not sick. You're just old and pathetic." The rain was coming down harder now, pounding on the roof of the truck like angry fists. I looked around desperately, trying to orient myself. "Lance, please, where are we? How am I supposed to get home? That's not my problem anymore." He reached across me and opened the passenger door. Cold, wet air rushed in, soaking my cardigan within seconds. "Run along, old woman. Time to learn how to take care of yourself." I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, not from the cold, but from the sheer impossibility of what was happening. "You can't be serious. You can't just leave me here. Watch me." Lance's voice was getting louder, more aggressive. "Ophelia was right about you. You're a parasite. You've been living off our kindness for too long, and we're done enabling your helplessness." The word helpless stung worse than any physical pain. I thought about all the years I'd spent raising Lance after his parents died in that car accident. He was only 8 years old when he came to live with me, scared and broken. I'd worked double shifts at the diner to pay for his clothes, his school supplies, his baseball equipment. I'd sat through every parent-teacher conference, every Little League game, every school play. "I raised you," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm. "When you had nowhere else to go, I gave you everything. And now it's time for you to figure out your own life." Lance grabbed my arm, not gently, and started pulling me toward the open door. "Come on, I've got places to be." I stumbled out of the truck, my sneakers immediately sinking into the muddy gravel. The rain hit me like ice water, plastering my gray hair to my skull and soaking through my clothes. I turned back to the truck, hoping to see some trace of the boy I'd loved and protected for 20 years. Instead, Lance was already putting the truck in reverse. Through the windshield, I could see him on his phone, probably calling Ophelia to tell her the deed was done. He didn't even look at me as he backed away. "Lance, wait." I called out, running after the truck as it picked up speed. Please don't do this. But he was already turning onto the main road, his taillights disappearing into the storm. I stood there in the middle of that empty lot, water streaming down my face, though I couldn't tell anymore what was rain and what were tears. The silence after his engine faded was deafening. Just me, the storm, and the crushing realization that the family I'd sacrificed everything for had just thrown me away like garbage. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands, hoping for one bar of signal, but the screen showed nothing. No service. No way to call for help. Thunder crashed overhead, and I looked around desperately for any kind of shelter. That's when I saw it. A small building in the distance, barely visible through the rain. It looked like it might be a gas station or convenience store. With nowhere else to go, I started walking toward it, every step a struggle against the wind and mud. As I trudged through that storm, completely alone and abandoned by the person I'd loved most in the world, I felt something inside me break. Not just my heart, though that was shattered beyond repair. Something deeper. The part of me that had always believed family meant something. The part that trusted love was unconditional. By the time I reached that little building, which turned out to be a closed auto repair shop, I wasn't the same woman who'd climbed into Lance's truck that morning. I was someone else entirely. Someone who finally understood that sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones you'd do anything to protect. The auto repair shop was locked, but there was a small overhang that provided some shelter from the worst of the storm. I huddled against the door, my teeth chattering so violently I could hear them clicking together. My clothes were soaked through, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe an hour, maybe 3. Time seemed to stretch and compress in strange ways. Every few minutes, I'd pull out my phone to check for signal, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. No bars, no hope of calling anyone, even if I'd had someone to call. That's when I heard the truck engine. At first, my heart leaped. Maybe Lance had come back. Maybe he'd realized what he'd done and returned to get me. But as the headlights cut through the rain, I could see it wasn't his red pickup. This truck was older, white, with rust along the wheel wells. The truck pulled up beside the repair shop, and an elderly man in a rain jacket jumped out. He was probably around 70, with white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Ma'am? Are you all right?" he called over the storm, hurrying toward me. I tried to answer, but my voice came out as more of a croak. The cold had settled deep in my throat, making it hard to speak. "Good Lord, you're soaked to the bone," he said, taking off his rain jacket and wrapping it around my shoulders. "I'm Harold Morrison. My wife and I live about a mile down the road. What in the world are you doing out here?" I wanted to tell him everything, but the words wouldn't come. How do you explain to a stranger that your own family just discarded you like trash? How do you admit that the person you'd raised from childhood had looked you in the eye and called you worthless? My ride left," I managed to whisper. Harold's face darkened with understanding. "Left you? In this weather? Who would do such a thing?" I couldn't answer that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "Well, come on then," Harold said gently. "Let's get you somewhere warm and dry. We'll figure out the rest later." He helped me into his truck, cranking up the heat until warm air was blasting from the vents. The simple act of kindness from this stranger made me start crying again. Deep, shuddering sobs that I couldn't control. Harold didn't ask questions during the short drive to his house. He just drove carefully through the storm, occasionally glancing over at me with concern. When we pulled into the driveway of a modest ranch-style home, he hurried around to help me out of the truck. The front door opened before we reached it, revealing a woman about Harold's age, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She took one look at me and immediately sprang into action. "Harold Morrison, what have you brought me now?" she said. But her tone was warm, affectionate. "Come here, honey. Let's get you into some dry clothes. This is my wife, Margaret," Harold said as she ushered me inside. "Maggie, this lady was stranded out at the old Murphy place. Someone left her there in the storm." Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. Left her? What kind of monster leaves an elderly woman in weather like this? That word, elderly, hit me harder than I expected. I'd never thought of myself that way before. In my mind, I was still the young woman who'd worked 3 jobs to support Lance, who'd stayed up all night when he had pneumonia, who'd cheered louder than anyone at his high school graduation. But standing there in Margaret's living room, dripping water on her clean floors, I suddenly felt every one of my 66 years. "Let's get you into a hot shower first," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. "Then we'll talk." She led me to a guest bathroom and provided me with clean towels and a warm robe. The hot water felt like a miracle against my chilled skin. As I stood under the spray, I let myself cry again, not the desperate sobs from earlier, but quieter tears of grief for the life I'd thought I had. When I emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, Margaret had prepared a mug of hot tea and a bowl of homemade soup. The kindness of these strangers was almost overwhelming. "Now then," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from me, "tell us what happened." So I did. I told them about Lance, about Ophelia, about the years I'd spent sacrificing for a family that saw me as nothing more than a burden. I told them about the medical bills Lance had complained about, bills I'd been trying to pay myself despite my limited Social Security income. I told them about the countless times I'd bitten my tongue when Ophelia made cutting remarks about my age, my appearance, my usefulness. Harold and Margaret listened without interruption, their faces growing more troubled with each detail. "That boy should be ashamed of himself," Harold said finally, his voice tight with anger, "after everything you did for him." "Where will you go?" Margaret asked gently. "Do you have other family?" I shook my head. Lance was all I had left. My husband died 15 years ago, and Lance's father was my only child. The reality of my isolation hit me fresh. "I suppose I'll have to figure out how to get home somehow." "Home to what?" Margaret's question was blunt but not unkind. "If they treated you this way once, what makes you think they won't do it again?" Her words settled over me like a cold blanket. She was right, of course. Even if I managed to get back to Lance's house, even if I crawled back and begged for forgiveness, nothing would really change. I'd still be the burden they resented. I'd still be walking on eggshells, trying not to be too much trouble, too expensive, too present in their lives. "You can stay here tonight," Harold said firmly. "Tomorrow, when the weather clears, we'll help you figure out your options." I wanted to protest, to insist I couldn't impose on their kindness, but the truth was I had nowhere else to go. No money for a hotel, no friends close enough to call, no family who wanted me. That night, lying in the Morrisons' guest bed under clean sheets that smelled like lavender, I stared at the ceiling and made a decision. I wasn't going back. I couldn't go back to being that woman who apologized for existing, who made herself smaller and smaller until she nearly disappeared. Lance had told me to learn how to take care of myself. Maybe it was time I did exactly that. The next morning, I woke to the smell of bacon and coffee. Margaret was already up, bustling around the kitchen with the easy efficiency of someone who'd been cooking for decades. "Sleep well?" she asked, pouring me a cup of coffee. "Better than I expected," I admitted. It was true. For the first time in months, I'd slept without worrying about being too much trouble, without wondering if someone was keeping track of every kindness they showed me. "Harold's gone into town to run some errands," Margaret said, setting a plate of eggs and bacon in front of me. "But before he left, he mentioned something interesting. The library in town is looking for a part-time volunteer, someone to help with their literacy program." I looked up from my breakfast. "A volunteer position?" "It wouldn't pay much," Margaret said quickly, "but it might be a start, a way to get your feet under you while you figure out what comes next." As I sat in that sunny kitchen, listening to Margaret hum while she washed dishes, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Maybe Lance had done me a favor after all. Maybe being abandoned in that storm was the push I'd needed to finally start living for myself. 3 weeks later, I was standing in front of the Millbrook Public Library, smoothing down my new skirt and checking my reflection in the glass doors. Margaret had taken me shopping at the local thrift store, helping me pick out clothes that fit properly, something I hadn't bothered with in years. When you're living as someone's burden, you don't invest much in your appearance. "You look wonderful, Vi," Margaret had said that morning, using the shortened version of my name that had somehow become natural between us. Not Viola, which always sounded so formal, and certainly not Grandma, which now left a bitter taste in my mouth. Just Vi. Simple, clean, like the new life I was trying to build. The library director, Susan Chen, was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an easy smile. She'd interviewed me the week before, and I'd been honest about my situation, up to a point. I told her I was recently widowed and looking to make a fresh start in a new town. I didn't mention Lance or Ophelia or the storm. Some truths were too complicated for job interviews. "Vi, welcome to the team," Susan said, leading me through the main floor of the library. "I'm so excited to have you help with our adult literacy program. Many of our students are older adults who never had the chance to learn to read properly. I think they'll relate to you wonderfully." As she showed me around, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. Not the hollow sense of duty that had defined my life with Lance and Ophelia, but genuine excitement about contributing something meaningful to the world. My first student was a man named Frank, probably in his early 70s, who'd worked construction his whole life and had hidden his illiteracy through a combination of street smarts and loyal friends. He was gruff at first, embarrassed about needing help, but something about our shared understanding of starting over later in life created an instant bond. "Never thought I'd be sitting in a library at my age," Frank said during our second session, struggling through a simple paragraph about gardening. "Never thought I'd be teaching in one," I replied, and he looked up at me with surprise. "You seem like the type who's always been around books," he said. I smiled, thinking about the years I'd spent reading to Lance when he was little, making up voices for different characters, watching his eyes light up with wonder. I've always loved stories. I just never had the chance to share that love with anyone who really wanted to learn. Frank nodded, understanding without needing details. That was one of the gifts I was discovering about this new life. People didn't need to know everything about your past to accept you in the present. After my shift at the library, I walked to my new apartment. It was a small studio above Mrs. Patterson's flower shop. Nothing fancy but clean and bright with large windows that let in plenty of sunlight. The rent was modest enough for my Social Security income, especially with the small stipend I earned from the library work. Margaret had helped me furnish it with items from garage sales and donation centers, a small table and 2 chairs, a comfortable reading chair by the window, a narrow bed with a quilt Margaret had sewn herself. It wasn't much, but it was mine in a way nothing had been mine in years. I'd kept my bank account in my legal name, Viola Patterson. I'd gone back to my maiden name after my husband died, though Lance had never approved of that decision either. But here in Millbrook, I was Vi Morrison. Not legally, of course, but socially. Margaret had introduced me to her friends that way, and somehow it had stuck. Vi Morrison, the librarian's assistant who lived above the flower shop. Vi Morrison, who had moved to town to start fresh after her husband's death. The lie felt surprisingly natural, maybe because it was closer to the truth than the life I'd been living. The woman who'd raised Lance, who'd sacrificed everything for an ungrateful family, who'd allowed herself to be diminished and dismissed. She felt like a stranger now. Vi Morrison was someone new, someone who could make her own choices and live by her own rules. Evenings were my favorite time. I'd make myself a simple dinner and sit by my window, watching the activity on Main Street below. Mrs. Patterson would lock up the shop around 6, waving up at my window before heading home to her own family. The restaurant across the street would fill with couples and families, their warm laughter drifting up through my open windows on pleasant evenings. I'd started keeping a journal, something I'd never done before. Writing down my thoughts helped me process the enormous changes in my life. "Tonight," I wrote, "Frank read an entire page today without stumbling once. His face when he finished was like watching the sun come up. I think I'm beginning to understand what it means to feel useful, really useful, for the first time in years." I paused, pen hovering over the page, thinking about Lance and Ophelia. Did they wonder where I was? Did they feel any guilt about what they'd done? Or had they simply moved on, relieved to be free of their burden? Part of me wanted to believe they were worried, that Lance was lying awake at night regretting his cruel words, but a larger, wiser part of me was beginning to understand that their feelings weren't my responsibility anymore. I'd spent so many years making myself smaller to accommodate their comfort, apologizing for my very existence, trying to be less trouble, less expensive, less present. Here in Millbrook, I didn't have to apologize for anything. When Mrs. Patterson asked me to water her plants while she visited her daughter, it was a favor between friends, not an imposition. When Margaret invited me for Sunday dinner, it was because she enjoyed my company, not out of obligation. When Susan praised my work with the literacy students, it was because I was genuinely helping, not because she felt sorry for me. The difference was startling. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be wanted rather than merely tolerated. 2 months into my new life, I received my first real test. Margaret and I were having coffee at the local diner when a familiar name drifted over from the booth behind us. "The Morrison place," someone was saying. "You know, Harold and Maggie Morrison. Sweet couple. Heard they've been helping some woman who got herself into trouble with her family." My blood ran cold. Margaret's eyes met mine across the table, and I could see her concern. "What kind of trouble?" the other voice asked. "Not sure exactly. Something about being abandoned somewhere. Maggie's been real cagey about the details, but you know how she is about taking in strays." Margaret's jaw tightened at the word strays, but she kept her voice level when she spoke. "Small towns," she said quietly to me. "People talk. It doesn't mean anything." But it did mean something. It meant my carefully constructed new identity could crumble at any moment. It meant that even here, 200 miles from my old life, I couldn't completely escape the possibility of being dragged back into that world of judgment and obligation. That night, alone in my apartment, I made another decision. If I was going to build a new life, I needed to do it properly. No more half measures, no more looking over my shoulder. I pulled out my phone and, for the first time since that terrible night, looked up Lance's number. Then I blocked it. Blocked Ophelia's too. Deleted their contact information entirely. If they wanted to find me, they'd have to work for it, and by then, I'd be ready for them. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was organizing children's books in the library's reading corner. Susan answered, and I could hear her speaking in low, concerned tones from her office. When she emerged, her expression was troubled. "Vi, there's someone on the phone asking about you," she said carefully. "A woman named Betty Hutchins. She says she's a neighbor of yours from your old town." My hand stilled on the book I was holding. A bright picture book about a little bear who gets lost in the woods. Betty Hutchins. I remembered her vaguely. An older woman who lived 3 houses down from Lance and Ophelia, the type who knew everyone's business and wasn't shy about sharing it. "She says it's important," Susan continued. "Something about your family being worried about you." I felt that familiar tightness in my chest. The same feeling I'd had whenever Lance would come home in one of his moods, ready to blame me for whatever had gone wrong in his day. But this time, instead of automatically apologizing and trying to fix things, I took a deep breath and made a choice. "I'll take it," I said, walking to Susan's office and closing the door behind me. Betty's voice came through the phone like a blast from a past I'd been trying to forget. "Viola? Viola Patterson? Thank goodness I found you. I've been calling libraries all over the state." "Hello, Betty," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "What can I do for you?" "Well, I should think you'd want to know what's been happening with that grandson of yours since you disappeared," Betty said, and I could hear the eagerness in her voice. She'd always loved being the bearer of dramatic news. "I didn't disappear, Betty. I moved." "Moved? Without telling anyone?" "Viola, people have been worried sick. Lance has been beside himself." That almost made me laugh. Lance, beside himself with worry about the burden he'd literally thrown away in a storm. What exactly has Lance told people about my departure? There was a pause, and I could practically hear Betty recalibrating her approach. "Well, he said you'd had some kind of breakdown. Said you wandered off during one of your doctor appointments, and he's been searching for you ever since." A breakdown. Of course, that's how he'd spun it. Poor Lance, dealing with his mentally unstable grandmother, who just couldn't handle the stress of aging. It was perfect. It made him look like the devoted grandson while painting me as the problem. "Betty, did Lance mention anything about the circumstances of my departure? About where exactly I was when I had this supposed breakdown?" Another pause. Longer this time. He said it was during a storm. That you got confused and wandered away from the car. I see. I kept my voice neutral, but inside I was seething. Even in his lies, Lance couldn't completely hide the truth. And how has Lance been handling my absence? That's when Betty's tone shifted, becoming more conspiratorial. Well, since you ask, things haven't been going too well for him and that wife of his. Ophelia's been having some difficulties. What kind of difficulties? Money troubles, mostly. Word is they've been behind on their mortgage for months. Lance lost his job at the warehouse about 6 weeks ago. Something about showing up drunk. Though Ophelia's been telling everyone it was budget cuts. My grip tightened on the phone. 6 weeks ago. That would have been just 2 weeks after they abandoned me. And there's talk about other problems too, Betty continued, clearly relishing having a captive audience. Ophelia's been seen around town with that Miller boy. You know, the one who works at the gas station. Young thing, maybe 22 or 23. People are starting to whisper. I thought about Ophelia, with her perfectly styled hair and her constant complaints about Lance not being ambitious enough, not making enough money, not giving her the life she deserved. It wasn't entirely surprising that she'd look elsewhere when things got difficult. But the real problem, Betty went on, is they can't manage without you. That house you all shared? It's falling apart. Nobody's been keeping up with the yard work or the repairs. Lance tried to fix the kitchen sink himself last month and flooded half the downstairs. Ophelia's been hiring people to come in and clean, but they can't afford it. The picture Betty was painting was becoming clearer. For all their complaints about me being a burden, Lance and Ophelia had relied on me for far more than they'd ever admitted. I'd been the one maintaining the house, managing the household budget, coordinating repairs and appointments. I'd been the stable center around which their chaotic lives revolved. There's something else, Betty said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I heard from my cousin who works at the bank. They're in real trouble, Viola. Real trouble. The foreclosure notice went up last week. Foreclosure. The house I'd helped pay for, the home I'd maintained and improved, was being taken away. And suddenly their desperate search for me made perfect sense. They didn't want me back because they missed me or felt guilty about what they'd done. They wanted me back because they needed me. Betty, I said carefully, has anyone mentioned calling the police about my disappearance? Oh, Lance filed a missing person report weeks ago. But between you and me, the police don't seem too concerned. They said since you're an adult and there's no sign of foul play, there's not much they can do if you don't want to be found. Smart officers. They'd probably seen this type of family drama before. I appreciate you calling to let me know, I said, but I want you to understand something. I didn't wander off in confusion, and I didn't have a breakdown. I made a conscious choice to leave a situation that was harmful to me. I'm safe, I'm well, and I'm exactly where I want to be. But Viola, they're your family. No, Betty, I interrupted, my voice firm. Family doesn't abandon each other in storms. Family doesn't call each other burdens. Family doesn't lie about what really happened when things go wrong. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I won't tell them I found you, Betty said finally, her voice much quieter now. But Viola, they're really struggling. Whatever happened between you all, they need help. After I hung up, I sat in Susan's office for a long time, staring out the window at the peaceful main street of Millbrook. Children were walking home from school, swinging their backpacks and chattering to their friends. An elderly man was walking his dog, stopping to chat with neighbors along the way. Normal life, uncomplicated by family drama and manipulation. So Lance had lost his job. Ophelia was cheating. They were losing the house. Part of me, the part that had spent decades putting their needs before my own, wanted to feel sorry for them, but a larger part, the part that was still angry about being thrown away like garbage, felt something else entirely. Justice. Not the cruel, vengeful kind of justice that takes pleasure in others' pain, but the quiet, inevitable justice that comes when people finally face the consequences of their choices. They'd decided I was expendable, that they could treat me however they wanted, because I'd always be there to absorb their anger and clean up their mistakes. Now they were learning what life looked like without me. That evening, I called Margaret and told her about Betty's call. We sat on her front porch, watching Harold tend to his garden while I recounted the conversation. "So they're looking for you," Margaret said when I finished. "How does that make you feel?" It was such a simple question, but it took me a long time to answer. How did it make me feel to know that the family who discarded me was now desperate to have me back? "Powerful," I said finally, surprising myself with the word. "For the first time in my life, I feel powerful." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Good. That's how you should feel. You hold all the cards now." As I walked back to my apartment that night, I thought about Betty's words. They need help. Maybe they did. But need and deserve were two very different things. And after 6 months of learning to live without the constant weight of their expectations and criticisms, I was beginning to understand the difference. It started with a single phone call to the library on a Thursday afternoon. Susan came to find me in the children's section, her face pale and concerned. "Vi, there's a man on the phone who says he's your grandson. He sounds upset." My hands went still on the books I was shelving. After 8 months of peace, they'd finally tracked me down. I'd been expecting this day, dreading it, but also preparing for it. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "Nothing yet. I said I needed to check if you were available. He's holding on line too." I followed Susan to her office, my heart pounding but my mind surprisingly clear. I'd had months to think about this moment, to decide how I would handle it when it came. "Hello, Lance," I said into the phone, my voice steady. "Grandma?" His voice cracked on the word, and for a moment he sounded like the 8-year-old boy who used to have nightmares after his parents died. "Grandma, thank God. We've been looking everywhere for you." "Have you?" There was a pause, as if he'd expected me to immediately start apologizing or explaining myself. When I didn't, his tone shifted. "Where the hell have you been? Do you have any idea what you've put us through? We thought you were dead. We've been worried sick." Worried sick. The same man who'd called me a parasite and left me to die in a storm had been worried sick. "What do you want, Lance?" "What do I want? I want you to come home. We need to talk. There's been a huge misunderstanding, and we need to work this out." A misunderstanding. That's what he was calling it now. "I'm quite comfortable where I am," I said. "If you need to talk, you can do it over the phone." "No, that's not—" "Grandma, you don't understand. Things have been really hard without you. We made some mistakes, but we can fix this. We're family." There was that word again. Family. The magical word they thought could erase everything they'd done. "Lance, I want you to listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice growing colder. "You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose to abandon your grandmother in a storm 200 miles from home. You chose to call me worthless and pathetic. You chose to tell people I had a breakdown rather than admit what you really did." "Grandma, please." "I'm not finished." My voice cut through his pleading like a knife. "You're calling me now not because you miss me or because you're sorry, but because you need me. Because you and Ophelia can't manage your lives without someone to blame for your problems and clean up your messes." The line went quiet for so long I thought he might have hung up. When he spoke again, his voice was different, harder. "You're right," he said. "We do need you, but you need us too. You're 66 years old, living God knows where, probably blowing through your savings. What happens when you get sick? What happens when you can't take care of yourself anymore?" It was a threat disguised as concern, and we both knew it. "I seem to be managing just fine," I replied. "For now. But we both know you can't keep this up forever. Come home, Grandma. We'll work things out. We'll be better." I closed my eyes, remembering all the times Lance had promised to be better. After he'd stolen money from my purse in high school. After he'd wrecked my car and lied about it. After he'd moved Ophelia into my house without asking, and then acted like I was the one inconveniencing them. "No," I said simply, and hung up. The phone rang again immediately. I let it go to voicemail, then it rang again, and again. Over the next 3 days, Lance called the library 62 times. Susan had to assign someone else to answer the phones because he was tying up the lines. When I refused to take his calls, he started leaving increasingly desperate messages. The first few were pleading, "Grandma, please just talk to me. I know we hurt you, but we can fix this." Then came anger. "This is ridiculous. You're acting like a child. We're trying to make things right and you won't even listen." Then desperation. "The house is gone, Grandma. We lost the house. Ophelia left me. I have nowhere to go. Please. And finally, threats. I know where you are now. I'm coming to get you whether you like it or not. You can't just abandon your family. Susan was concerned enough to call the local police, but they said there wasn't much they could do unless Lance actually showed up and caused a disturbance. Until then, it was just harassment. And I could file a restraining order if I wanted. I didn't want to involve the law if I could help it. This was between Lance and me. On Saturday morning, I was watering the flowers outside Mrs. Patterson's shop when a familiar red pickup truck pulled up to the curb. My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to keep watering, to appear calm even though my hands were shaking. Lance got out of the truck and I was shocked by how he looked. He'd lost weight and not in a healthy way. His clothes were wrinkled and hung loose on his frame. His hair was greasy and he had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. "Hello, Lance," I said, without looking at him. "Jesus, Grandma, you look." He trailed off, staring at me. I suppose I did look different. The months of peaceful living had been good to me. I'd put on some healthy weight. My skin had color from spending time outdoors, and my clothes fit properly. I looked like a woman who was taking care of herself instead of someone who was simply surviving. "You look good," he finished lamely. "Thank you, you don't." He flinched at my bluntness. The old me would have immediately softened the blow, would have asked if he was eating enough, if he needed money, if there was anything I could do to help. The new me just kept watering the flowers. "Can we talk?" he asked. "We're talking now." I mean, really talk. Somewhere private. I looked at him then, this young man I'd raised, and felt a strange mixture of pity and disgust. He looked desperate, beaten down by life in a way that might have broken my heart 8 months ago. Now it just made me tired. "You can say whatever you need to say right here," I told him. Lance glanced around nervously. We were on Main Street, and although it was early, there were already people walking their dogs and getting coffee at the diner across the street. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "for what we did that night, for leaving you. It was wrong." I waited for more, but apparently that was the extent of his apology. "And?" I prompted. And I want you to come home. I know things got out of hand, but we can start over. I've learned my lesson." "What lesson is that, Lance?" He looked confused by the question. That family is important? Try again." His face flushed red. "I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to say what you learned. I want you to understand what you did wrong so I know you won't do it again." Lance was getting agitated now, his voice rising. "I said I was sorry. What more do you want? You're my grandmother. You're supposed to forgive me." There it was, the entitlement that had always been there, just barely hidden beneath the surface. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done to me. He was sorry that it had consequences for him. "No, Lance," I said quietly. "I'm not supposed to do anything anymore. That's what you taught me that night in the storm. Don't be like this," he pleaded. "I know you're mad, but you're all I have left. Ophelia's gone. The house is gone. I lost my job. I need you." And there it was, the truth he'd been dancing around. He didn't want me back because he loved me or missed me. He wanted me back because his life had fallen apart without someone to take care of him. "That sounds like a lot of problems," I said, moving to the next planter. "I'm sure you'll figure something out. Grandma, please." His voice broke, and for a moment he sounded like that scared little boy again. "I don't know how to do this without you." I stopped watering and looked at him directly. "You should have thought of that before you threw me away." Lance's face went through several emotions: hurt, anger, desperation. Finally, his expression hardened into something ugly and familiar. "You know what? Fine. Be stubborn. But don't come crawling back to me when this little fantasy life of yours falls apart. You're not as young as you think you are, and someday you're going to need help. Don't expect it from me." With that, he got back in his truck and drove away, tires squealing against the asphalt. I finished watering the flowers, my hands steady now that the confrontation was over. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway of her shop, having obviously witnessed the entire exchange. "You okay, hun?" she asked gently. I looked down the street where Lance's truck had disappeared, then back at the peaceful morning scene around me. People going about their lives, children playing in the park across the street, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakery. Yes, I said, and meant it. I'm exactly where I need to be. 2 years passed like pages turning in a good book, peacefully, with purpose, each day better than the last. I'd been promoted to head of the adult literacy program at the library, earning enough combined with my social security to live comfortably. Frank had learned to read well enough to help his own grandson with homework, and we'd started a small reading group for other late-in-life learners. I'd also started volunteering at the local senior center, teaching basic computer skills to people my age who wanted to stay connected with distant family. The irony wasn't lost on me, helping others maintain family relationships while having completely severed my own. But it felt right. These were people who were valued by their families, who had grandchildren who called just to chat rather than to demand. Margaret had become the sister I'd never had, and Harold the protective older brother I'd always wanted. They'd officially adopted me into their family, including me in holiday celebrations and treating me like I'd always belonged. It was the first time in my life I'd experienced unconditional love from people who weren't obligated to care about me. On a crisp October morning, I was arranging books in the library's front window display when I saw a familiar figure walking slowly down Main Street. Even from a distance, I recognized the posture, the way she carried herself like she was performing for an invisible audience. Ophelia. She looked older than her years, her once perfect blonde hair now showing dark roots and split ends. Her clothes were still stylish but worn, like someone trying to maintain appearances on a shrinking budget. She was walking hesitantly, checking building numbers, clearly looking for something, or someone. I watched her pause in front of Mrs. Patterson's flower shop, looking up at my apartment windows above. Then she crossed the street and headed directly for the library. I had perhaps 30 seconds to decide how to handle this. I could slip into the back office and have Susan tell her I wasn't available. I could go out the rear exit and avoid the confrontation altogether. But something in me had changed over these 2 peaceful years. I was no longer the woman who hid from difficult conversations or apologized for existing. When Ophelia walked through the library doors, I was standing at the circulation desk, calm and ready. She stopped short when she saw me, her carefully applied makeup doing little to hide the shock on her face. I suppose I looked different again, confident, well-dressed, completely at ease in my environment. Not at all like the broken woman they'd abandoned in that storm. "Viola," she said, her voice uncertain. "Ophelia." I kept my tone neutral, professional. "What brings you to Millbrook?" She glanced around the library, taking in the displays I'd created, the reading corner where my literacy students gathered, the bulletin board full of community announcements and success stories. This was clearly not what she'd expected to find. "We need to talk," she said finally. "About what?" Ophelia's composure slipped for a moment, revealing something I'd never seen in her before. Vulnerability. About Lance. About everything that's happened. I gestured to a quiet seating area near the windows. "We can talk here." She followed me, her high heels clicking against the polished floor. Even in her reduced circumstances, she was still trying to project an image of sophistication. "You look well," she said as we sat down. "I am well. Very well." That's good." She fidgeted with her purse strap, clearly struggling with what to say next. "Viola, I know we didn't part on good terms. That's one way to put it. I want you to know that I regret how things ended. We both said things we didn't mean." I studied her face, looking for signs of genuine remorse. What I saw instead was calculation, the same expression she'd worn whenever she was trying to manipulate Lance into buying her something expensive. "What did you say that you didn't mean?" I asked. The question seemed to catch her off guard. I said a lot of harsh things over the years. About your age, your health issues, your financial situation. Those weren't things you said that night in the storm, Ophelia. Those were things you said constantly for years, because that's what you actually thought of me. Her mask slipped further. "You have to understand. We were under a lot of stress. The mortgage, Lance's drinking, my job situation. We weren't thinking clearly. Lance's drinking. That was new information, though it explained some things about how they'd fallen apart so quickly after I left. "Where is Lance now?" I asked. Ophelia's face crumpled slightly. He's not doing well, Viola. After I left him, he really went downhill. He's been living in a trailer park outside the city, working part-time at a gas station when he can keep a job. He's drinking more, and he's angry all the time." She paused, wiping at her eyes with a tissue. "He talks about you constantly, about how you abandoned him, how you're selfish for not helping when he needs you most." The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. Paint Lance as the victim, make me feel guilty for his poor choices, then swoop in with whatever she really wanted. "And what about you?" I asked. "How are you doing?" "I'm managing," she said quickly, then seemed to realize that wasn't the right approach. "Actually, no. I'm not managing well at all. I'm working 2 part-time jobs, living in a studio apartment. I had to sell my car and take the bus here." She leaned forward, her voice becoming more urgent. "Viola, I know we treated you badly. I know we took you for granted, but we're family, and families forgive each other. They help each other when times are hard." There it was, the ask. I waited for her to continue. "I'm not asking for much," she said. "Just enough to get back on my feet. Maybe help Lance get into a treatment program. We could all start over. Be the family we should have been." I sat back in my chair, looking at this woman who had spent years making my life miserable, who had encouraged Lance to see me as a burden, who had probably been the one to suggest abandoning me that night. "Ophelia," I said quietly, "do you remember what Lance said to me that night in the storm?" She shifted uncomfortably. "He was upset. We both were. He called me a parasite. He said I was pathetic, and that you were right about me. He told me to run along and learn to take care of myself." I kept my voice level, matter of fact. "So I did. But that's not who you really are," she protested. "You're kind and generous and loving. You raised Lance when no one else would. You sacrificed everything for him. You're right. I did sacrifice everything for him. My savings, my health, my self-respect, my happiness. I gave him everything I had, and in return, he threw me away like garbage." Ophelia's eyes filled with tears. Whether real or performed, I couldn't tell anymore. "People make mistakes, Viola. Even terrible mistakes. But that doesn't mean they can't change." "You're absolutely right," I said, standing up. "People can change. I'm living proof of that." She looked up at me, confusion replacing the hope that had been building on her face. I changed from someone who allowed herself to be used and discarded into someone who knows her own worth. I changed from someone who apologized for existing into someone who lives with purpose and dignity. I changed from someone who was afraid of being alone into someone who enjoys her own company and chooses her relationships carefully. I walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful street where I'd built my new life. What I won't change back into is someone who rescues people from the consequences of their own choices. "But we're family," Ophelia said desperately. I turned back to face her. "No, we're not. Family doesn't abandon each other in storms. Family doesn't call each other parasites. Family doesn't lie about what really happened when things go wrong." She was crying openly now, and for the first time since I'd known her, it looked genuine. "What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to survive without you?" "The same way I survived without you," I said simply. "By learning to take care of yourselves." I walked back to the circulation desk and picked up a piece of paper, writing something quickly. Then I returned to Ophelia and handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked. "The address of a social services office in your area. They have programs for people with addiction issues and job training for people who need new skills. If Lance genuinely wants help, that's where he should start." Ophelia stared at the paper like it was written in a foreign language. "But what about us? What about our relationship?" "We don't have a relationship, Ophelia. We never did. You tolerated me because I was useful, and I tolerated you because I thought that's what family meant." I sat down across from her one final time. "I want you to listen to me very carefully, because this is the last time we're going to have this conversation." I am not responsible for fixing Lance's life or yours. I am not obligated to sacrifice my happiness for your comfort. I am not going to apologize for choosing to live in peace rather than chaos. You can't just cut us off forever, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I'm not cutting you off. I'm setting boundaries. If Lance gets sober, if he gets his life together, if he learns to take responsibility for his actions and genuinely apologizes for what he did, not because he wants something from me, but because he understands how deeply he hurt me, then maybe we can have a conversation, maybe. I stood up again, signaling that our conversation was over, but that's his choice to make, not yours, and not mine. Ophelia gathered her purse and stood shakily. At the library door, she turned back one more time. I hope you'll change your mind, she said. I hope you won't need me to, I replied. After she left, I sat in my chair by the window for a long time, watching the familiar rhythms of my adopted town. Mrs. Patterson was arranging autumn flowers in her shop window. Harold was walking his dog, stopping to chat with neighbors. Children were walking home from school, their laughter carrying on the crisp air. This was my life now. These were my people. This was my peace. Frank arrived for his reading session, bringing a new student, his neighbor, who'd finally worked up the courage to admit he needed help with literacy. Vi, Frank said with a grin. Meet Joe. He's ready to start his own reading adventure. I smiled, pushing thoughts of Lance and Ophelia firmly into the past where they belonged. Welcome, Joe. Let's begin with something simple. How about a story about new beginnings? As I opened the book and began to read, I felt that familiar sense of purpose wash over me. This was who I was now, Vi Morrison, librarian, teacher, friend. A woman who helped people build themselves up rather than one who allowed herself to be torn down. Outside, autumn leaves danced in the wind, spinning away from their branches to make room for new growth. Some endings, I realized, are really just beginnings in disguise. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.